My name is Madison Reynolds, and I'm 28 years old. Last Saturday night, I watched my family's faces transform from smug superiority to absolute shock in the span of 30 seconds. It happened at my brother Jake's engagement party, right after they'd spent the evening calling me the family dropout and making jokes about my failed life choices. What they didn't know was that my husband was about to walk through those doors, and their entire perception of reality was about to shatter. Before I tell you how their laughter turned to stunned silence, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been the black sheep who proved everyone wrong. Trust me, you'll want to see how this story ends. Growing up in the Reynolds family meant living in the shadow of my golden child brother Jake. From the moment we could walk, the favoritism was obvious and painful. Jake was the star quarterback who could do no wrong, while I was the artistic dreamer who never quite met their expectations. When Jake brought home B+ grades, our parents celebrated. When I brought home straight A's along with my art portfolio, they'd pat my head and say, "That's nice, dear, but when are you going to focus on something practical?" The pattern was set early and never changed. I remember one particularly painful Christmas when I was 14. I had spent months creating a handmade photo album for our parents, filled with family memories and decorated with my artwork. Jake had forgotten to buy gifts entirely and grabbed a generic gift card from the gas station on Christmas morning. Guess whose present they gushed over? "Oh, Jake, you're so thoughtful. Madison, your little craft project is sweet, but next time maybe just help your brother pick something nice instead." That night set the tone for everything that followed. College applications, career choices, relationship decisions. Every milestone in my life was measured against Jake's achievements and found wanting. When Jake announced he was majoring in business, our parents called it sensible and promising. When I declared my intention to study fine arts, they staged what amounted to an intervention, complete with charts showing average artist salaries and unemployment rates. The breaking point came during my sophomore year of college. I had been struggling to balance my coursework with 2 part-time jobs, desperately trying to prove I could make my artistic dreams financially viable. My photography had started gaining recognition. I'd won 3 regional competitions and had several pieces displayed in local galleries. But when I excitedly called home to share the news about my first paid commission, my mother's response was devastating. "Madison, honey, this hobby phase needs to end. Your father and I have been talking, and we think you should transfer to a practical major. Maybe business, like Jake. We can't keep supporting these unrealistic fantasies." The word fantasies hit me like a physical blow. These weren't fantasies. They were carefully crafted goals backed by genuine talent and growing success. But in my family's eyes, if it wasn't Jake's path, it wasn't worth pursuing. That phone call changed everything. I realized I would never earn their respect by trying to fit into their narrow definition of success. I would have to create my own path, even if it meant walking it alone. What my family never understood was that their rejection didn't break me. It forged me into someone stronger. Every dismissive comment, every comparison to Jake, every time they introduced me as our daughter who's still figuring things out while proudly detailing Jake's latest achievement, added fuel to a fire that would eventually consume their smugness entirely. The irony is that while they were so focused on Jake's conventional success, they completely missed the empire I was building in plain sight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how Saturday night unfolded, you need to know about the years of humiliation that led up to that moment, and how I transformed every slight into stepping stones towards something they could never have imagined. The decision to drop out of college came during my junior year, but not for the reasons my family assumed. By then, my photography business had exploded beyond anything I could have imagined. What started as weekend wedding shoots had evolved into high-end commercial work for major brands. I was earning more in a month than most of my classmates' parents made in a year, but my family saw only the surface. Their daughter quitting school without a degree. The night I told them was brutal. We were having one of our mandatory family dinners, the kind where Jake would regale everyone with stories of his internship at Dad's friend's law firm, while I sat quietly, knowing that anything I shared would be dismissed. I had prepared for weeks, gathering financial statements and client testimonials, ready to prove that my decision was based on success, not failure. "I'm leaving school," I announced during dessert. "My business has grown to the point where I need to focus on it full time." The silence that followed was deafening. My father set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Madison, we've talked about this photography hobby. It's time to be realistic." "It's not a hobby, Dad. I made $180,000 last year." Jake laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on, Maddie. Instagram followers don't count as income. I pulled out my phone and showed them my business banking app. The number on the screen was undeniable. My mother glanced at it and frowned. That can't be real. You're 21 years old. It's real. Mom, I have contracts with 3 major corporations and a waiting list of clients extending into next year. I need to hire employees and expand my studio space. College is holding me back. My father's face had turned red. Absolutely not. You will finish your degree. This little photography thing will dry up, and then what? You'll have nothing to fall back on. This isn't a phase, Dad. It's my career. It's what I'm good at. What you're good at, my mother interjected, is making poor decisions. Look at Jake. He's graduating summa cum laude with a business degree and has already been accepted to law school. That's what success looks like. The comparison stung, but I pressed on. I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to build my business. I want to create something meaningful. Meaningful? Jake scoffed. Taking pictures at weddings is meaningful? I do commercial work for Fortune 500 companies, Jake. My photography has been featured in national magazines, but you wouldn't know that because none of you have ever bothered to ask about my actual work. The conversation devolved from there. Terms like irresponsible, throwing your life away, and family embarrassment were thrown around freely. When I finally left that night, my father's parting words followed me to the car. Don't come crawling back when this whole fantasy collapses. We won't be here to pick up the pieces. I didn't go back. Not for months. The official dropout happened quietly. I withdrew from classes, moved my belongings out of the dorm, and rented a proper studio space downtown. My business doubled within 6 months. Without the constraints of class schedules and academic obligations, I could take on bigger projects, travel for shoots, and really focus on building something extraordinary. But my family's narrative never changed. To them, I was still the dropout daughter who had thrown away her education for a pipe dream. They told relatives I was going through a rebellious phase. They stopped mentioning me in their annual Christmas letters. When people asked about their children, Jake's achievements got a full recitation while I was dismissed with, "Madison is still finding herself." The worst part was how they weaponized my absence against me, since I rarely attended family events, partly due to my demanding schedule, but mostly because every gathering became an intervention about my life choices. They painted me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family for selfish pursuits. Jake, meanwhile, continued his golden child trajectory. Law school graduation with honors, passing the bar exam on his first try, landing a position at a prestigious firm. Each milestone was celebrated with elaborate parties and social media posts proclaiming their pride in their successful son. My growing business empire remained invisible to them. The engagement announcement came via a group text that felt more like a royal decree than a family update. Jake had proposed to his longtime girlfriend Sarah, a fellow lawyer from an equally accomplished family. The engagement party would be held at the country club, formal attire required, extended family invited. "I hope you can make it," Jake had texted me privately. "Sarah's family is excited to meet everyone." What he really meant was, "Please try not to embarrass us in front of the in-laws." I almost didn't go. My calendar was packed with client shoots, and frankly, the thought of spending an evening being subtly criticized while Jake received praise made me nauseous. But something about the way they expected me to hide away bothered me more than usual. I had built something incredible, something that should have made any family proud, yet I was still treated like the family disappointment. 3 days before the party, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to attend, but not as the ashamed dropout they expected. I was going as exactly who I had become, accompanied by someone who would make their assumptions about my life impossible to maintain. What my family didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask about, was how dramatically my life had changed in the 5 years since I'd dropped out. They saw my absence from family events as evidence of failure, but the truth was far different. I had been too busy building an empire to waste time on their disapproval. The photography business had evolved into something none of us had anticipated. What started as wedding shoots had expanded into commercial photography, then corporate consulting, then media production. By year 3, I wasn't just taking pictures. I was running a full-service creative agency with 12 employees and a client roster that read like a Fortune 500 directory. The turning point came when I landed a contract with Hamilton Industries, a multinational corporation that needed a complete rebrand. The project was worth $3 million, and established my reputation in the corporate world. Within months, other major companies were reaching out, not just for photography, but for comprehensive marketing strategies and creative direction. I had stopped trying to explain my success to my family after that disastrous dinner conversation. When they asked about my work during our rare interactions, I gave vague answers about freelance photography, and let them maintain their assumptions. It was easier than fighting their predetermined narrative about my life, but success in business was only part of the story. The other part involved someone my family had never met. Someone whose existence would have shattered every assumption they'd made about my failed life choices. I met David Chen at a corporate event I was photographing for a tech startup. He was the guest speaker, a soft-spoken man in his early 30s who commanded the room's attention without raising his voice. His presentation on sustainable technology solutions was brilliant. But what struck me was how he talked to everyone, from the CEO to the catering staff, with the same genuine respect. After the event, he approached me as I was packing my equipment. "Your work tonight was exceptional," he said. "You captured moments I didn't even realize were happening." We talked for 2 hours about art, business, and the intersection of creativity and commerce. David was incredibly intelligent and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone who, I learned later, was worth more than most small countries' GDP. David Chen wasn't just successful, he was revolutionary. At 28, he had developed and patented a series of clean energy technologies that were transforming how major corporations approach sustainability. His company, Chen Innovations, held contracts with governments worldwide and had made him one of the youngest billionaires in tech. But David wore his success lightly. He drove a modest car, lived in a beautiful but not ostentatious home, and was more likely to discuss his latest environmental project than his financial achievements. What drew me to him wasn't his wealth. I didn't even know about that initially, but his passion for making a meaningful impact on the world. We began dating quietly. David valued privacy, partly due to his high-profile business dealings, but also because he'd had enough experiences with people who were more interested in his bank account than his personality. For the first few months, we kept our relationship low-key, meeting for coffee between my shoots and his board meetings, taking long walks where we could talk without interruption. The first time David saw my work portfolio, his reaction was immediate and genuine. "Madison, this is extraordinary. You're not just documenting moments, you're creating them. Have you considered expanding into documentary work?" His encouragement led to my most ambitious project yet, a documentary series about sustainable business practices that would eventually air on major networks and win 3 industry awards. David provided not just emotional support, but strategic advice, helping me navigate the complex world of media contracts and distribution deals. We married 18 months after we met, in a small ceremony attended by close friends and David's family. I had invited my parents, but they declined, claiming they had prior commitments. Jake was in the middle of bar exam prep and couldn't get away. The message was clear. My wedding wasn't important enough to prioritize. David's family, by contrast, welcomed me warmly. His parents, both retired professors, were delighted to have a creative daughter-in-law. His sister, a doctor, became one of my closest friends. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, celebrated my successes, and never once suggested that my career was a phase I needed to outgrow. Marriage to David changed my life in ways that had nothing to do with money. Yes, financial security was liberating. I could take on passion projects without worrying about cash flow, and I could invest in better equipment and larger studio space. But more importantly, being with someone who valued my ambitions as much as his own gave me a confidence I'd never experienced. David's influence extended to my business strategy. With his guidance, I began acquiring smaller creative agencies, building a network of specialized teams that could handle everything from product launches to crisis management. By our first anniversary, Reynolds Creative Group had offices in 4 cities and annual revenues exceeding $50 million. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had worried that dropping out of college would leave me financially unstable, while my actual life had evolved into something beyond their wildest expectations. I was now the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, married to one of the most successful entrepreneurs of our generation, and living a life that checked every box they claimed to value, except they didn't know any of it. We kept our lives private, partly out of preference, but also because David's security team recommended discretion. High-profile tech executives faced unique risks, and maintaining a low public profile was both safer and more comfortable for both of us. So when Jake's engagement party invitation arrived, my family had no idea that the dropout daughter they planned to showcase as a cautionary tale had actually built the kind of success story they could only dream of. They were expecting Madison, the struggling photographer. They were about to meet Madison Reynolds Chen, CEO and wife to a billionaire who was currently revolutionizing clean energy technology across 3 continents. David had been traveling for business during most of the family drama leading up to the party, but he was scheduled to return the day of the event. When I told him about my family's patterns of behavior and their expectations for the evening, his response was characteristically thoughtful. "I think it's time they met the real you," he said simply. "Not the version they've created in their minds, but who you actually are. And if they can't appreciate that, at least you'll know you gave them the chance. The week leading up to Jake's engagement party was surreal. My family's group chat buzzed constantly with updates about arrangements, menu changes, and guest list additions. Reading their messages felt like watching a performance I wasn't supposed to be part of, even though I was technically invited. Make sure the photographer captures the family photos properly, my mother wrote. We want these memories to be perfect. Should we mention Madison's bringing someone? Jake asked. Sarah's parents are curious about the family. Let's just see how the evening goes, Dad replied. No need to complicate things unnecessarily. The subtext was clear. They were hoping I'd either come alone or not come at all. The idea that I might have a serious relationship, much less a marriage, wasn't even on their radar. In their minds, I was still the irresponsible young woman who had thrown away her education for an unstable career. I had mentioned bringing my husband in my RSVP response, but apparently they'd dismissed it as either a mistake or wishful thinking. When I confirmed with Jake that David would be attending, his response was telling. Oh, the photographer guy? That's cool, I guess. Just so you know, Sarah's family is pretty traditional. Maybe don't mention the whole college thing. I didn't correct his assumption about David's profession. Let them maintain their illusions for a few more days. David returned from his business trip to Singapore on Friday, exhausted but excited to finally meet my family. I had told him stories about their dynamics over the past 2 years, but experiencing it secondhand would be different. He was genuinely curious about the people who had shaped me, even if that shaping had often been painful. Are you nervous? He asked as we prepared for the party Saturday evening. Honestly, I'm more excited than nervous. They've spent years telling me I've ruined my life. Tonight, they get to see what I've actually built. David adjusted his tie. A simple but expertly tailored piece that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, though you'd never know it from looking at it. He had a gift for wearing expensive things in a way that made them look understated. Just remember, he said, taking my hand. Their opinions don't define your worth. They never did. I had chosen my outfit carefully, an elegant black dress that was sophisticated without being flashy, paired with the pearl necklace David had given me for our first anniversary. I looked successful but not ostentatious, professional but not intimidating. The goal was to appear as the accomplished woman I had become, without triggering their defensive mechanisms too early in the evening. The country club venue was exactly what I expected. All mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers designed to impress. Jake and Sarah had spared no expense, which made sense given that both their families were footing the bill. As we walked through the entrance, I spotted familiar faces from extended family and family friends I hadn't seen in years. My Aunt Carol was the first to notice us. Madison? Oh my goodness, look at you. She embraced me warmly, then turned expectantly to David. Aunt Carol? I'd like you to meet my husband, David Chen. The surprise on her face was immediate. Husband? But I thought, when did you? We've been married for over a year, I explained gently. It was a small ceremony. Carol's confusion was understandable. My parents had clearly not shared news of my marriage with the extended family, probably because they either didn't believe it was real or didn't consider it worth mentioning. David charmed her immediately, asking thoughtful questions about her recent retirement and her volunteer work with literacy programs. Within minutes, she was beaming and insisting we sit with her family during dinner, but I could see my parents across the room, and their expressions were less welcoming. My mother's eyes had narrowed as she took in my appearance, clearly noting that I looked more polished than expected. My father was engaged in conversation with what appeared to be Sarah's parents, probably building up Jake's accomplishments while hopefully avoiding the topic of his other child. Jake approached us with Sarah in tow, both wearing slightly forced smiles. Madison, you made it. And this must be David Chen, my husband, I said smoothly. David, this is my brother Jake and his fiancée Sarah. Sarah's reaction was immediate and telling. Her smile became genuine as she took in David's presence, the confident posture, the expensive watch, the subtle markers of success that people from her background were trained to recognize. It's wonderful to meet you, David, she said warmly. What do you do? I work in technology, David replied modestly. Clean energy solutions primarily. Jake looked confused. I thought you were a photographer. That's Madison's field, David corrected gently. She's incredibly talented. Her documentary series on sustainable business practices has been nominated for 3 industry awards. The information clearly surprised Jake, who glanced at me with something approaching respect for the first time in years. But before he could respond, my parents materialized beside us. Madison, my mother said stiffly. You look nice. The qualifier stung, but I maintained my composure. Thank you, Mom. I'd like you to meet my husband, David. My father extended his hand reluctantly, as if he were greeting a door-to-door salesman rather than his son-in-law. I wasn't aware Madison was married. We've been married for 18 months, David replied evenly. It's wonderful to finally meet Madison's family. She speaks of you often. The polite fiction hung in the air between us. I had mentioned them, but not in the way David's diplomatic phrasing suggested. And what is it you do, David? My mother asked, her tone suggesting she was prepared to be unimpressed. I develop clean energy technologies, he replied. My company works with governments and corporations to implement sustainable solutions. That's nice, she said dismissively. Is that stable work? The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. David's company had government contracts worth billions, but my mother was asking about job security as if he were a freelance handyman. Very stable, David assured her. We're fortunate to work on projects that make a meaningful environmental impact. My father's attention had already drifted away, clearly categorizing David as another of Madison's questionable choices that didn't warrant serious consideration. But I noticed Sarah listening intently, and her expression suggested she was picking up on details my parents were missing. The cocktail hour continued with more of the same. Extended family members expressed surprise about my marriage, confusion about my career success, and genuine interest in getting to know David better. My parents, meanwhile, seemed determined to minimize our presence, steering conversations toward Jake's achievements whenever possible. Jake's been promoted to senior associate already, my mother announced proudly to a group of family friends. His firm says they've never seen someone advance so quickly. That's wonderful, David said genuinely. Madison has built something remarkable too. Her creative agency employs dozens of people and works with some of the country's largest corporations. The redirect was subtle but effective. Suddenly, people were asking me questions about my business, expressing surprise at its scope and success. I could see my parents' discomfort growing as their narrative about my failed life was quietly challenged by the reality standing before them. But the real confrontation was still coming. I could feel it building as the evening progressed, as the contradictions between their assumptions and reality became harder to ignore. Sarah's parents had begun asking David pointed questions about his background, and his modest but truthful answers were clearly making an impression. When someone mentioned that David's company had recently been featured on the cover of Tech Innovator magazine, Sarah's father, a successful businessman himself, suddenly became much more attentive. The shift in dynamics was palpable. My parents, meanwhile, were beginning to realize that their dismissive treatment of my husband might have been premature. But their pride prevented them from acknowledging their mistake directly. Instead, they doubled down on their original narrative, as if repeating it loudly enough would make it true. The breaking point came during dinner, when my father stood to make a toast that would finally force the confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating for years. Dinner was served promptly at 7, with my family strategically seated at the head table, while David and I were placed with extended relatives, a subtle but clear message about our perceived importance in the family hierarchy. I didn't mind. My cousins and their spouses were genuinely interested in our lives and asked thoughtful questions about both my business and David's work. But I could see my parents becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. David's quiet confidence and the deferential way Sarah's parents had begun treating him clearly didn't match their expectations for Madison's husband. When Sarah's father mentioned recognizing David's name from a recent Forbes article about young entrepreneurs changing the energy sector, my mother's face went pale. The moment I had been anticipating arrived when my father stood to make his toast. The room quieted as he raised his champagne glass, clearly relishing his role as the patriarch delivering wisdom to the next generation. Tonight we celebrate not just Jake and Sarah's engagement, he began, his voice carrying easily through the dining room, but the union of two accomplished young people who represent the best of what hard work and dedication can achieve. He paused dramatically, clearly building to his main point. Jake has shown us what real success looks like, graduating summa cum laude, excelling in law school, and now building a career at one of the city's most prestigious firms. He's proof that staying the course and making responsible choices leads to a meaningful life. The indirect criticism was unmistakable. Without mentioning me by name, he was using Jake's achievements to highlight what he saw as my failures. I felt David's hand squeeze mine gently under the table, a silent reminder that their opinions didn't define my reality. Some people, my father continued, his gaze drifting briefly in my direction, choose unconventional paths that may seem exciting, but lack the stability and respectability that come from traditional success. Tonight reminds us of the value of making smart, practical decisions about our futures. The room had gone uncomfortably quiet. Even Jake looked embarrassed by the barely veiled attack on his sister during what should have been a celebration of his engagement. "So let's raise our glasses," my father concluded, "to Jake and Sarah, who represent everything we could hope for in the next generation of our family." The toast was met with polite applause, but the tension was palpable. I could feel dozens of eyes on me waiting to see how I would react to being publicly dismissed at my own brother's engagement party. I stood slowly, my heart racing but my voice steady. "I'd like to add something to that toast, if I may." My father's expression shifted from satisfaction to alarm. This clearly wasn't part of his script. "You're absolutely right, Dad," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Tonight is about celebrating success and the choices that lead to meaningful lives." I couldn't agree more. I turned to face the room, including Sarah's parents, who were watching with intense curiosity. "I'd like to share some of the choices I've made, since they seem relevant to tonight's theme." I paused, letting the anticipation build. 5 years ago, I made the decision to leave college and focus on building my photography business. Many people thought that was irresponsible. My mother's face had gone ashen. She clearly sensed that I was about to shatter their carefully constructed narrative. That business evolved into Reynolds Creative Group, which now employs 47 people across 4 cities and generates annual revenues of over $50 million. We work with companies like Hamilton Industries, Morrison Tech, and Chen Innovations to create marketing strategies that have revolutionized how major corporations approach branding. The room was dead silent now. Sarah's father, who I'd learned was a successful businessman himself, was staring at me with undisguised interest. "But tonight isn't really about my business success," I continued, my confidence growing with each word. "It's about family and the people who support us in achieving our dreams." I turned to David, who was watching me with pride and encouragement. "I'd like everyone to meet my husband, David Chen. We've been married for 18 months, though apparently that news didn't make it into the family newsletter." David stood gracefully, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. David is the founder and CEO of Chen Innovations, which develops clean energy technologies for governments and corporations worldwide. His work is literally helping to save the planet, one sustainable solution at a time. I could see my parents exchanging panicked glances as the implications of what I was saying began to sink in. David's company holds patents on technologies that are being implemented by major corporations globally. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine last year as one of the innovators changing the world, and his net worth was estimated by Forbes at just over $3 billion. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mother actually gasped audibly. My father's face had gone from red to white in the span of 30 seconds. "But more importantly," I continued, my voice softening as I looked at David, "he's the kind of person who values creativity, supports ambitious dreams, and believes that success comes in many forms, not just the traditional paths that some people think are the only valid choices." David stepped forward slightly, his voice calm and warm as he addressed the room. "I want to thank Madison's family for raising such an extraordinary woman. Her creativity, intelligence, and business acumen have built something truly remarkable. I'm honored to be her husband, and I'm grateful to finally meet the people who shaped her into the incredible person she became." The diplomacy in his words was masterful. He was simultaneously praising me while gently highlighting my family's failure to recognize my achievements. Sarah's father was the first to break the silence. He stood and raised his glass. "To Madison and David Chen," he said loudly, "congratulations on your success, both personal and professional. You're clearly an extraordinary couple." The toast rippled through the room as people raised their glasses, many of them staring at my parents with expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. The narrative about the dropout daughter had just been obliterated in front of their entire social circle. My mother attempted damage control, her voice shaky as she said, "We're very proud of Madison, of course. We've just been discreet about her success. She values her privacy." But it was too late. The contradiction between their toast praising traditional success and the reality of my achievements was too stark to explain away. Everyone in the room now knew that the parents who had just lectured about making smart, practical decisions had completely failed to recognize their own daughter's extraordinary accomplishments. Jake approached our table during the dessert course, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and genuine remorse. "Madison, I had no idea about, well, any of this. Your business, your marriage, any of it. Why didn't you tell us?" The question hung between us, loaded with years of hurt and misunderstanding. "I tried, Jake," I said quietly. "When I started the business, when I got engaged, when I achieved every milestone that should have mattered to a family. But every time I shared good news, it was dismissed as unrealistic or unimportant. Eventually, I stopped trying. David added gently, Madison has invited you to several of her gallery showings and business events over the years. When no one from her family attended, she assumed you weren't interested. The revelation clearly stunned Jake. He turned to look at our parents, who were deep in conversation with Sarah's family, probably attempting their own damage control. I never got those invitations, he said slowly. I sent them to the family group chat and to your personal email, I replied. Maybe check your spam folder. The implication was clear. Either my family had actively ignored my attempts to include them, or they had been so dismissive of my career that they hadn't bothered to read my messages carefully. Sarah approached our table next, her expression completely different from the polite confusion she'd shown earlier. Madison, I owe you an apology. I've been hearing about Jake's sister who dropped out of college for months, and I made assumptions that were clearly completely wrong. She glanced at David with newfound respect. I'd love to learn more about your work, David. Sarah's father owns a manufacturing company that's been exploring sustainable practices. He'd be fascinated to hear about your innovations. The evening continued with a steady stream of family members and guests approaching our table, eager to learn more about the successful couple they'd somehow overlooked. My business cards disappeared quickly as people expressed interest in my creative services, and David found himself in detailed conversations about clean energy implementation with several business owners in attendance. My parents, meanwhile, sat at the head table looking increasingly isolated as their social standing shifted dramatically. The people they'd hoped to impress with their successful son narrative were now far more interested in getting to know their accomplished daughter and her remarkable husband. The final blow came when Sarah's father approached my parents directly, his voice carrying clearly across the nearby tables. You must be incredibly proud of Madison and David. Their achievements are extraordinary, especially for such a young couple. You've raised a remarkable daughter. My father's response was barely audible. Yes, we're very proud. But everyone could see the truth in their expressions. They weren't proud, they were mortified. Mortified that they had so completely misjudged their daughter's life. Mortified that they had publicly dismissed achievements that far surpassed anything they had ever accomplished. And mortified that their attempt to use my brother's success to highlight my failures had backfired so spectacularly. The ride home was quiet, both David and I processing the evening's events. As we pulled into our driveway, he finally spoke. How do you feel? He asked gently. I considered the question carefully. Vindicated, I said finally, but also sad. It shouldn't have taken a public revelation for them to see my worth. No, he agreed. It shouldn't have, but sometimes people can't see what's right in front of them until something forces them to look differently. The next morning brought a flood of text messages. Jake was first. Madison, can we talk? I realize I've been a terrible brother, and I want to understand how we got here. My mother's message came an hour later. Honey, we need to have a family conversation. There are clearly things we've misunderstood about your life. Even my father, who rarely texted, sent a brief message. Your achievements are impressive. We should discuss things properly. But the message that surprised me most came from Sarah. Madison, I hope we can be friends. I'd love to learn from your business experience, and I think you and David would be wonderful additions to our social circle. Thank you for handling last night with such grace. Over the following weeks, my family attempted to rebuild our relationship, though it was an awkward process. My parents struggled to reconcile their assumptions about my life with the reality they'd discovered. They wanted to take credit for my success. We always knew Madison was special, while simultaneously avoiding responsibility for their years of dismissal and neglect. The conversation that mattered most came 3 weeks after the engagement party. Jake asked to meet for coffee, just the two of us, in a neutral location where we could talk honestly. I need to apologize, he began, without preamble, not just for that night, but for years of letting mom and dad's favoritism continue without speaking up. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, but that was cowardice. I appreciated his directness. The favoritism wasn't your fault, Jake. You didn't ask to be the golden child, but I benefited from it, and I never questioned it. He replied. I never asked about your work because I assumed it wasn't important. I never defended you when they made disparaging comments because it was easier to stay quiet. That makes me complicit. His honesty was refreshing, even if it was overdue. I appreciate you saying that. But Jake, this can't just be guilt over being caught looking foolish at your engagement party. If you want a real relationship with me, it has to be because you value me as a person, not because you've discovered I'm more successful than you expected. You're right, he admitted. And honestly, I'm still processing all of this. I've spent my whole life believing that my path was the only valid one, that success looked like law school and a corporate job. Seeing what you've built, it's forced me to question a lot of assumptions. The conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about childhood memories, about the pressure he'd felt to be perfect, about my loneliness in a family that never seemed to see me clearly. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. My parents' attempts at relationship repair were less successful. They wanted forgiveness without fully acknowledging the depth of their mistakes. During our first family dinner after the engagement party, my mother kept trying to rewrite history. "We always supported your creativity," she insisted. "Remember how we bought you that art set for Christmas?" "Mom," I said gently but firmly. Supporting my creativity would have been coming to my gallery showings, asking about my business, or celebrating my achievements. Buying art supplies doesn't erase years of telling me my dreams were unrealistic. My father struggled even more with the new dynamic. He had built his identity around being the successful patriarch whose judgment was unquestioned. Learning that his dropout daughter had far surpassed his own achievements challenged everything he believed about success and his role as a father. "I don't understand how we missed all of this," he said during one particularly difficult conversation. "You never told us about the business growth or the marriage. I tried to tell you, Dad, multiple times. But every time I shared good news, you either dismissed it or changed the subject to Jake's accomplishments." Eventually, I stopped trying. David, to his credit, remained patient and diplomatic throughout these family conversations. He never criticized my parents directly, but his very presence served as a reminder of how wrong they had been about my life choices. The most significant change came in how extended family and family friends treated me. Word of the engagement party revelation had spread quickly through their social circle. Suddenly, I was receiving invitations to events I'd never been included in before, business networking opportunities, and genuine interest in my work. Aunt Carol called to apologize for years of accepting my parents' narrative without question. "I should have reached out to you directly," she admitted. "I let them control the information, and that wasn't fair to you." The business implications were substantial as well. Sarah's father did indeed reach out about sustainable practices for his manufacturing company, leading to a lucrative consulting contract. Other connections from the engagement party resulted in 3 new major clients and partnerships that expanded my company's reach significantly. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationship with David's family. His parents, who had welcomed me warmly from the beginning, were thrilled to see my own family finally recognizing my worth. His sister organized a celebration dinner for us, inviting both families and creating an environment where my achievements could be properly acknowledged and celebrated. 6 months later, Jake and Sarah's wedding presented another test of our evolving family dynamics. This time, I was asked to be in the wedding party, not as an afterthought, but because Sarah genuinely wanted me there. My parents' behavior was markedly different. They introduced me to guests as their accomplished daughter who runs a successful creative agency, and they included David in family photos without hesitation. During the reception, my father approached me with something approaching humility. "Madison, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. I let my own narrow definition of success blind me to what you are accomplishing. I failed you as a father, and I'm sorry." It wasn't a perfect apology. There was still an element of self-focus in his phrasing, but it was more accountability than I had ever received from him. "Thank you for saying that, Dad," I replied. "I appreciate the acknowledgement. Is there a way forward?" he asked. "Can we rebuild our relationship?" I considered his question carefully. "Yes, but it has to be based on who I actually am, not who you wish I were. And it can't just be words. It has to be consistent actions over time." He nodded solemnly. "I understand. I want to try." The healing process wasn't linear. There were still moments when old patterns emerged, when my parents would make comments that revealed their lingering belief that their way was inherently superior. But there was also genuine effort. My mother started attending my gallery showings and asking thoughtful questions about my work. My father began reading industry publications to better understand my field. Most importantly, they stopped comparing me to Jake. His achievements were celebrated on their own merits, and mine were as well. It was a small but significant shift that made family gatherings bearable, then eventually enjoyable. David watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. "You've taught them something valuable," he observed one evening after a particularly successful family dinner. "You've shown them that success isn't just about following predetermined paths. It's about having the courage to create your own." A year after the engagement party that changed everything, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. She was crying, which was unusual enough to get my immediate attention. "Madison, I need to tell you something," she said through her tears. I was going through old photos today, looking for pictures for your father's birthday slideshow, and I found all the invitations you sent us over the years. All the gallery openings, the business award ceremonies, the events we never attended. She paused to compose herself. I found the wedding invitation too. The one we threw away because we thought it was just you being dramatic about some casual relationship. I realized today how much we missed, how many opportunities we had to support you that we just ignored. Mom, I said gently, that's in the past now. But it shouldn't be, she insisted. You achieved extraordinary things, and instead of celebrating with you, we were dismissive and cruel. I don't know how to live with that. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. For the first time, she wasn't trying to minimize their mistakes or deflect blame. She was simply acknowledging the truth of what had happened and expressing genuine remorse. The way forward, I told her, is to be present for what comes next. You can't change the past, but you can choose to be supportive going forward. That conversation marked a turning point. My parents began making genuine efforts to understand my world, attending industry events with me, asking David thoughtful questions about his work, and treating our marriage with the respect it deserved. The relationship would never be perfect. Too much damage had been done, and too many years had been lost. But it was functional, sometimes even warm, and that felt like enough. 2 years after that fateful engagement party, David and I announced that we were expecting our first child. The family's reaction was everything I could have hoped for: genuine excitement, immediate offers of support, and enthusiastic planning for the baby's arrival. My father, who had always been awkward with emotional expressions, surprised me during a quiet moment at the announcement dinner. "This child is going to be incredibly lucky," he said. "They'll have parents who understand that success comes in many forms, and who will support whatever path they choose to take." It was perhaps the most meaningful thing he had ever said to me, because it showed that he had genuinely learned from our family's painful history. As I reflected on the journey from that devastating engagement party to this moment of family unity, I realized that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places. Being called the dropout in front of my brother's future in-laws had been humiliating in the moment, but it had also been the catalyst for my family to finally see me clearly. I had spent years trying to earn their approval through achievement, not understanding that the problem was never my lack of success. It was their inability to recognize success that didn't fit their narrow expectations. The engagement party had forced them to confront the gap between their perceptions and reality, and that confrontation had ultimately freed all of us from the toxic dynamics that had defined our relationships for so long. David often said that the best revenge is a life well lived, and he was right. But I had learned something even more valuable. The best vindication isn't proving others wrong. It's proving yourself right. The moment I stopped seeking my family's approval and started building the life I wanted, I found the peace and confidence that no external validation could provide. The little girl who had been told her dreams were unrealistic had grown up to build an empire. The dropout had created more wealth and impact than anyone in her family had ever imagined possible. But most importantly, the daughter who had felt invisible had learned to see herself clearly, and that self-knowledge had been worth more than all the recognition that eventually followed. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who should have seen it all along? Drop a comment below sharing your own story of overcoming family expectations. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of triumph over family toxicity. Remember, sometimes the people who believe in you least can motivate you to achieve the most, not to win their approval, but to prove to yourself just how extraordinary you truly are. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you in the next story.